All right. Welcome everyone to our second conversation with Vershawn Young. For those of you that attended our first event, welcome back. And many thanks to Vershawn Young for hosting this continuing conversation. Just as a recap, in conversation one, we discussed big picture issues, how George Floyd served as a catalyst for last year's protests, possibly the largest in history. And we provided an overview of This Ain't Yesterday's literacy, using part of our meeting to show the multimodality of the text as presented in Top Hat, and how the text is designed to interact with students, and also how we've tried to provide sufficient background to enable meaningful conversations about social and linguistic justice. So today, we'll provide a very brief overview for those who did not attend, but we'll focus primarily, as promised, on what is showcased in Unit 4, particularly decolonizing rhetoric. This conversation in general will be framed by the 4C's position statement created by Vershawn Young and his colleagues called "This Ain't Another Statement, This is a Demand for Black Linguistic Justice." I do want to thank all of you for again submitting questions with your registration, bringing light to the fact that writing is happening right now in various contexts across the curriculum in which linguistic justice pedagogies need to be employed, whether that be in the writing center in the context of peer review, in graduate courses, or in composition classrooms. This comment from Rebecca at Western Illinois, I think, highlights both the difficulty and the opportunity before educators. Rebecca wrote, "I've been using this text this semester," and she's referring to This Ain't Yesterday's literacy. "After the initial dropping of the course by students who didn't want to be part of this discussion, I've been getting some really thoughtful responses in writing from students around the issues that are raised." Other comments also named challenges, hesitancy about employing linguistic justice pedagogies, and the resistance faced from fellow faculty members, TAs learning to teach for the first time, students themselves concerned with learning standard American English. In other words, meeting expectations of the real world, quote unquote. So this is, of course, what has faced us for a long time, how to enact change at the institutional and cultural level. And while we have taken your questions into consideration while shaping this talk with Vershawn, please feel free to use the chat function to pose other questions as we go along. So this is the perfect segue to introduce Vershawn and have him speak to both the 4C's position statement he helped create and the idea of general resistance to meaningful change. So I'm happy and pleased, as always, to welcome Vershawn Young. Most of you are familiar with his work. He's a professor at the University of Waterloo and the recent former chair of the 4Cs. And he's likely best known for his sociolinguistic concept of code meshing, co-author or author of 10 books, and works primarily in areas of African American studies and gender studies. So Vershawn, I'm going to turn to you now and ask if you can briefly describe the urgency of the statement and respond to concerns faculty are expressing about initiating change in the classroom and at the institutional level. Do we have you, Vershawn?
Oh, hi.
There we go.
Is it just my voice?
I hope it's both. I see you.
Oh, you do? Okay, fine. I didn't know whether my camera was muted or not. Well, thank you, Christine, for that introduction, and welcome to the faculty and individuals who are joining this session. I'm happy to be a part of this conversation about this book that we've put together. So speaking about the demand that is in the Black linguistic justice statement, you asked what the urgency was. And I think the urgency emanated from two things that I can point to. One is the exigencies that came out of the protests after the murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis. And in the summer of 2020, those protests were not just about police brutality and the use of excessive force that lead to Black people being killed or murdered while they're in police custody. But it was also about the connection of language, rhetoric, and culture to that particular social circumstance. So people recognize and understand that those protests were not just about the murder of George Floyd. They were about what that murder represented. That murder represented a entrenchment of white supremacy. It represented a continued entrenchment of the idea that Black people's lives are expendable, and that Black people's cultures, their very ways of being, are subjugated and oppressed in North America in particular, but connected to anti-Black sentiment across the globe. So this statement was a statement that spoke to the ways in which those circumstances are present in classrooms where Black students are present, and not just in the classroom where they're present, but in the ideologies and ideas that teachers carry with them about language into classrooms and into writing instruction and into setting standards for which Black language habits are assessed and addressed. And so the statement is showing the connection between the classroom and the street. Now, this statement it's not like 4C's, the Conference on College Communication and Composition, and NCTE, the National Conference of Teachers of English, haven't had a statement or statements prior to this one that addressed linguistic justice. The prior statement from 1974 is students' rights to their own language. And even though that statement and its longer background have been in circulation for the past 48 or almost 50 years, there still has been a reluctance, it seemed, on the part of educational institutions, writing programs, et cetera, to actually honor and recognize students' rights to their own language. They want to, many times unwittingly, sometimes very consciously, deny those rights to students, deny their right to use their languages and their language habits in all sectors of society, particularly in the classroom. So that's why the Committee on Composing a C Statement on Anti-Black Racism and Black Linguistic Justice framed their statement as a set of demands, because the prior statements had just been ignored for the most part, or they have been explained away, or they have been segregated, or, those, as I mentioned, students' rights have been not adhered to and privileged. And so these scholars, April Baker Bell, Davina Jackson, Lamar Johnson, Carmen Kennard, Tierra McMurdy, and Bonnie Williams Ferrier, they said that they wanted to create a statement that no longer allowed teachers and administrators to ignore what they would be doing when it came to Black language habits, if they didn't allow those to be incorporated in classrooms. And so they set it out as a set of demands for how teachers must respond. It's not optional, right? And so we don't want to go through another cycle of George Floyd's or Breonna Taylor's or Trayvon Martin's. We want to to see the classroom be a space where white supremacy does not remain as it has been dominant.
Yes. And there's a lot of anxiety still, all these years, and the right to use your own English, in the comments from faculty, there was still a lot of present anxiety, as I was describing. One of the things we grappled with was how to organize the book we built together in a progressive and illuminating way that would make the classroom efforts towards linguistic justice make sense to students within the context of social justice. So even though we are focusing around Unit 4 mostly today, I think it's useful to those joining us for the first time to maybe briefly describe the trajectory of the entire book so that folks new to this conversation and our project can see sort of the holistic goals shaping the text. So Vershawn, do you want to speak a little bit just briefly to what the units are trying to do here?
Sure, and I took some notes, so I just need to find my notes in order to speak briefly so I don't go off topic. Which I am sometimes accustomed to doing. So yeah, Unit 1 starts with the murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin, which we all know that murder precipitated a number of, not just a number, but widespread protests across the globe. And I should say that the person that filmed that 8 minutes was Darnella Frazier, and she's talked about in the book, in the introduction to the unit. Anyway, the first unit gives the important historical context and unpacks myths about racial progress and argues that we haven't come nearly far enough in combating racism and white supremacy. However, Unit 1 also showcases the many academic institutions that were making statements demanding progress. And this is particularly important because one of the academic institutions that released a statement was the National Math Association. And the National Math Association recognized that they could be doing more even in ending white supremacy within its discipline. And so it's very important, Unit 1, to show that this was I want to say, a widespread movement that influenced many academic and social and cultural institutions as well as businesses. Unit 2 demonstrates a history of social action without enough resulting action, actually, and explains such controversial terms like defund the police and what that actually means. It shows that defund the police doesn't mean take away the funding, but differentiate the funding to provide other social services that could benefit the communities that police serves. So bringing people into the fulsomeness of these particular debates and conversations. Unit 3 is something many people asked me to speak about, the N-word and its use. And some people might say its use and abuses, but Unit 3 on the N-word is called appropriate cultural and educational uses. It does not remanufacture the dead and no-win debate of whether or not the word can be used. It begins with the premise that the N-word can be used and actually should be, but in what context, in an educational setting, and in what context in cultural and social settings. It's a very important unit. And then Unit 4 argues for acceptance and the embrace of Black English as an embodying and rich system of meaning, a rule-governed language. But I must say that Unit 4 does not remanufacture justifications for Black English. Again, just like the 4C statement, which is a demand, this unit begins with the premise that Black English and Black rhetoric are compatible with standard academic discourse modes and actually also standard English, that Black English is compatible with those ideas, and to think that it isn't is actually the ideologies that we're trying to fight against, and at least educate individuals about. Unit 5, this is where we need to go from here. What can allies, accomplices, and people who are interested in pursuing social justice do, right? So it includes statements of allyship from large corporations and shows a high investment and commitment to social change now. I'm really excited that the culminating activity in this unit is one that allows each individual, teachers as well as students, to engage in a writing assignment or a speech assignment. They could do it in a variety of different modes, but it gives them the opportunity to individually express their commitment to social change and analyze and assess the ways in which it's within their very power now to do so.
Yeah, something you and I have talked about is how it's possible that faculty perceive the use of standard American English as much more static than that conversation actually is in higher ed. I've had people pose questions of, how to shape a writing class, for instance, around this reader. How does the reader support the many rhetorical lessons embodied by the study of writing, the actual teaching of writing, the research that occurs? So can you speak a little bit to the idea that standard American English is so entrenched and that, we can't budge up against that? Because some of the anxiety I hear is sort of just about that resistance. How has that landscape changed?
Well, I'm not sure that the landscape has changed that much, but the thing is that people who, the anxiety is about something that is false. We have anxiety, the anxiety about standard American English sort of is about something, to say it again, that doesn't really exist. Not that standard English doesn't exist, but it is not true. This is not true. It is not linguistically true. What I'm about to say is not linguistically true, nor could it ever be the case that Black English is not compatible with standard English. It has, what people have to understand, and what the unit actually also does, is help us understand how we get to the idea that Black English is incompatible with standard English, right? What kind of dominant language ideology have we attained or developed to exclude a fully functioning version and variety of English? That is what the unit actually does, right? And so it helps us to deal with those anxieties because it unpacks the knowledge about Black English, right? And shows that it's compatible. Let me give you a couple examples. One example is, and this is referenced in some of the readings in the book, although it isn't itself a reading. I'm quoting from Lisa Green's book, Black Language and the Child. And Green is a linguist. And she says that when African-American English speakers are speaking in the formal register, right, that it is very difficult to tell where African-American English ends and standard English begins because they're already so compatible. But we have, what we have accepted as true is a segregationist ideology about Black English that wants it always to be not a rule-governed language, but informal slang, which is just not true. Black English is not informal slang. It has all levels of language, just like any language, formal, mid, and informal. And in the formal register, which we most often use in school, it is fully compatible with standard English. Now, it will look different from other communities and other regions' use of standard English, but it's like that everywhere for every person, right? So think about this. I'm a Midwesterner. When I'm using standard English in the Midwest, there are differences to that language construction than from what Southerners use as standard English. There are some overlapping rules and principles, but there are quite a few divergences as well. And this is how we should understand standard English and academic discourse anyway. And we also need to sort of stop focusing only on the concept of standard English. That's only one part of language of effective rhetorical delivery and dissemination. It is not the whole thing, right? We also have to talk about rhetoric. So in the book, there is a reading on African-American rhetorical principles, which I have identified at least 5. And because it's living and generative, there are way more. There's language, there's suasion, there's community, there's perspective, and there's discourse. So this unit actually helps teachers to decenter the 3 Greek topoi of ethos, pathos, and logos, which is not, can be useful as one part. But when we're talking about language and suasion and discourse and community, those are the rhetorical principles that teachers can use as frameworks for conducting rhetorical analysis. For example, take a piece in this unit. For instance, my essay, Should Writers Use Their Own English, which is a hybrid code-meshed piece that uses elevated standard English mixed with the low register of African-American English, not the formal register, but the low register. Now, the reason why I did that was so that the article itself can be a performance against this idea that they're incompatible, right? Because even the lower register is compatible with academic conventions, academic discourse, and standard English, as that essay shows. But if you did a rhetorical analysis using the 6 principles of African-American rhetoric, like language, you can identify the different language codes that's used in that one essay. Now, let me slow down here, because in that essay, I introduced the concept of code meshing and code switching. Now, the definition of both of them from the linguistic perspective, not the community perspective, is 2 languages or dialects operating in one speech act, 2 or more. So if a teacher used that definition and said, okay, how many languages are code meshed here? And what are the registers of those languages? Then it's opening students' eyes up and the teacher's eyes to actually see that language forms, diversity of language forms, can be mixed, and that they are routinely mixed in academic writing, not just in the humanities, but actually across the disciplines. So does that answer your question?
I think that, one of our main goals was exposure, right, to all these ideas. The reasons we curated this text. And I want to apologize. I'm seeing a little bit in the chat that some people might have lost you for a moment, Vershawn. So I hope that was only momentary. But it looks like it's solved. But I do want to further contextualize that this book responds to faculty who reached out to us as publishers, right? Asking for this exposure, asking us to showcase Black voices and scholars and art and calls to action. And somebody complimented the art already in our chat, which I want to call out Antonia Ruppert, who is a Black artist that we engage and is very responsible for all the beautiful presentation of this book. That is another way we showcase art. So I think that just giving people a sense of what we've done here is a fun thing to do right now, because you're talking about, you know, there are multiple Englishes happening. We are exposing through this reader to the multiple ways we brought these conversations together. So for instance, this slide, we're bringing Martin Luther King Jr. into conversation with a very recent spoken word. And then in the further reading, bringing back MLK in an original speech. So it's kind of amazing how we've been able to pair and leverage the multifunctional, multimodal presentation in the Top Hat version of this book. So I think what we circle around in decolonizing rhetoric in particular in Unit 4 is, I think people are looking for, and Lindsay, do we have a next slide? Okay, so this is our moment,
Christina,
right?
can we go back to the previous slide just for a moment?
Sure.
Oh, because I just want to point something out about how this works. When I want to get the right words to say, the book has tried to bring into an academic conversation, cultural and social conversations. And it does what the Academy does best, which is to interrogate and actually think deeply about some of the ideas, ideologies that circulate in common culture. But the Academy has the responsibility to look at them in depth and to test them out. So one thing that happens here is this, you see on, well, it's my left, it's the picture of an overreaction, Sandra O'Neill, the spoken word artist with the pearls on. She references in this Black Lives Matter spoken word piece what she calls the disfigured cultural image of Martin Luther King as a benign cultural worker. And she actually refutes that particular perspective that is common now and points out how Martin Luther King's language is very different than what most people understood him to have said or to understand what's behind his rhetoric. That's an academic exercise to really gain the knowledge and take closer look at what's actually happening and to test cultural assumptions. And so this is a perfect example of that happening. And Martin Luther King's speech here that's included amplifies what his rhetoric was really all about. So it gives an example of that in this academic context.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think a lot of the questions from faculty for this conversation was, really those big picture questions still, beyond us building this reader and really trying to facilitate the exposure of the conversation. Faculty are very concerned with adapting writing pedagogies that avoid contributing to issues of systemic racism and just practical ways to begin the work.
Right. So I see on this slide a quote from that statement from the Black Linguistics Justice Statement that says teachers must be trained to recognize Black language and work toward dismantling anti-Black linguistic racism in their curriculum, instruction, and pedagogical practices. We have to slow down here on this statement, on this particular excerpt, because teachers have to do a little bit of homework in order to get up to speed, because even though most people are required to take in their training some form of equity, diversity, and inclusion training, they probably have not been trained in Black sociolinguistics or Black linguistics, which means they're going to have to do some reading. Now, part of that reading is in this book, right? I mean, we have great excerpts that brings them into a knowledge of Black language. The other part is the statement itself is a performance. So you have to think about the theory and the actual action as of, or the enactment of Black language. And so teachers also need to read more pieces by Black scholars or by Black writers, so that they both have the theoretical knowledge, but also the impressionistic knowledge and the performative knowledge of what it is. Now, I just want to point out here that one of the first things we have to dismantle is anti-Black linguistic racism. In other words, that is a negative, subordinate attitude about Black language and Black people. That's first. Teachers want to jump to the pedagogy. How do we teach it? Well, first, you got to deal with the attitude. What is your perspective and perception? Not the person down the hall, not the teacher across the street. Don't put this off on someone else. I can't do this or think about this because what about when my students go into the business world? We're not talking about that yet. We're talking about you. What is your attitude and perception about Black linguistic justice? Because if you have a perspective or attitude that is not white supremacist, that is not emanate from standard language ideology, and it is very anti-racist, the question of the teacher down the hall or the business person across the street will never be a barrier to what you do pedagogically. Never. As a matter of fact, you will be able to see why what those people that we are imagining might think are just simply wrong and retrograde and inhibiting progress. So teacher attitude is first, then thinking about or simultaneously recognizing patterns of Black language, which I argue there is not one person in America, I would say even new arrivals to America, I would argue, that do not have some knowledge, some cultural knowledge about Black language. It's impossible because our culture is so saturated with Black rhetorical forms, Black language and Black styles. It's everywhere. It's on the news, it's in newscasters' voices, it's in the writings in the New York Times and the Washington Post, it's in academic art. It's everywhere. And we are all influenced by it. But what the biggest thing is the perceptions and the attitudes that we hold about it. So those have to work simultaneously.
Wow. Lindsay, I think we have on one of our slides, we are speaking to that. And also throughout Unit 4.
Yeah, when I look at this table of contents, I just want to jump up and down because I'm so excited. It's like, wow, look at that. You got the introduction, you have James Baldwin talking about Black English, and he goes into deep detail from a writerly perspective about Black English, sort of, and he's dealing with the debate about Black English that arose in the late 60s and 1970s, right? After the end of segregation and at the rise of busing and so forth, where Black students were now found themselves in classrooms with white students. And this question was about whether Black English is an acceptable form of communication, way back then. And he's like, well, yeah, here's how. And then you got Kochman, who's a linguist, and we've ignored Kochman. Thomas Kochman is so wonderful. But in this essay, Culture and Communication, Implications for Black English in the Classroom, this essay is from 1969, but he actually shows us something that we have ignored as a profession. And that is, we have geared our instruction towards some people's natural cultural abilities, what they bring from home to school, basically white middle-class students. Not all white students, white middle-class or upper-class students, particularly from the Midwest. We've geared instruction toward what they already bring. He makes this argument. If we can gear instruction towards what they already bring, we're not saying dismiss it. We're saying, why can't we add what Black students already culturally are bringing? Black students are already culturally bringing a love affair with oral language. It's undeniable. Rap, hip hop, all around us, we know that Black people have a love affair with oral language, with language in general. And he says, why not build on that orientation in the classroom? And he says, we need to think about the ways in which that orientation gears us towards professionalizing Black students. He says that orientation is geared especially for salesmen, businessmen, politicians, and others, right? So when we think about professional and technical writing and communication, and that Black styles are already primed to be at the height of business speakers and political speech, then it's a reframing of our attitudes, right? It's a reframing that says we must be teaching students this and allowing them to use what they're bringing from home. So I saw this again and I was like very, very excited.
Yeah, Unit 4 really, so this is like the good news for faculty, right? Like we are really trying to help and we're trying to show, and I think that a lot of the concepts, although we are focused on Black English in our book, I mean, a lot of people have international students and students of different ethnicities that bring rich cultural, knowledge into the classroom. And I think it extends, right, across the board in how we should be looking at our students and what they're actually doing and how they're actually communicating. We had a lot of questions about code meshing in particular and the power of Black semantics. But you have a little bit of a different take. Like that's not actually what we're trying to do. We're not so much trying to teach students to code mesh as we are trying to expose them to the power of language. Am I phrasing that correctly, or would you put it differently?
I would say that's one thing, that we are trying to expose them to the power of language. We're also trying to expose them to ideologies, both the ideology that prevent us from understanding rhetorical forms or accepting particularly Black rhetorical forms, and exposing, and I'm sorry, not exposing, but amplifying an introduction to those Black rhetorical forms. Another introduction, because as I said, we're all already influenced by them, but this puts them sort of, so to speak, in your face and asking people to sort of talk about them. But Christina, I want to say, when people make the move away from Blacks to others, as if to say, we can't focus only on, or particularly or especially on Black people without seeing how it is applicable to other minorities, I think that, that sets up a false equivalence, or I should say a false disparity might even be a better way of saying it. Because if you're not, what people first need to accept and admit is that the focus now, if we're not doing something different, is on white supremacist modes, which full stop.
Yeah.
So and we have taken it for granted, the painful reality that we apply and force that particular mode on diverse peoples. That's what we call white supremacy. We're not calling white supremacy racism. We are saying that we have put one cultural perspective, experience, and mode of interacting above everybody else, even when all those other people are in the classroom or in society with us, and say, now you all have to do what these people are primed to do. That is what is commonly happening. Well, Black focusing on Black people's experiences fundamentally in this country has been the historical baseline of protest against oppression. That applies to almost every other cultural group, because if you're pushing against the dominant ideology or the standard language ideology, you are then pushing against that as a supreme pedagogy or a supreme experience for other people. It already is going to dismantle it.
Yep, I see what you're saying. I noticed one of your demands, you actually employed Black English, and then we've also made the effort to provide assignments. Let's see, your camera just went off for Sean.
I'm still here.
Okay, good. So you are clear.
We demand that teachers respect Black thought and how that thought manifests in Black speech and writing. That is, it might not sound like you desire it to, but remember, it sounds real right, regardless of unrelenting white supremacist socialization. I would put this statement, I would cut this out if I were teaching this in a real in-person class, not online. I'll tell you the online version in a sec. I would put this statement, I'll have it blown up and put it in the classroom on the day in which we read one of those essays, particularly should writers use their own English. Or June Jordan's essay on Willie, or any one of them, and say, okay, so what doesn't sound right here, or how we might desire it, but how does it also, in a code mesh fashion, sound real right, regardless of the unrelenting white supremacist socialization. And the other thing, when you look closely at this statement, the essence, the fuel of this is Black, but this sentence is almost entirely standard English. This is what I was saying about the relationship between Black English and standard English is such that when it's in the formal mode, it's very difficult to ascertain where Black English ends and standard English begins. Without the cultural marker here in the first line, respect, which approximates and tends to represent Black phonology, the speech aspect of Black language, by replacing the T with the K for cultural language pronunciation styles. The other parts of this is standard, but the way in which it's constructed, right, in the second sentence with the several parenthetical expressions is a Black rhetorical mode. It's a Black rhetorical mode which shapes the standard English here. That's why Black rhetoric and Black English are important to consider together, because people have this is why, Christina, we were talking earlier, and you were iterating that people had said something about, well, what if my students want to learn standard English? What am I teaching them? I'm like, it's not the students anyway. I believe that that's teachers thinking about their worst fears. But the other thing is that no one is saying you have to give up what school requires. What we have to give up is white supremacy. But effective language is never off the table. That's the only thing on the table. And in fact, if we are not allowing students to use their languages as resources, we are doing them a disservice, and we're not doing our jobs. So the languages that they bring and the language habits that they bring to a classroom are always resources. What those teachers have to understand is that they are putting a barrier up where there should never be a barrier. There should never be barriers in language. Let me give you an example or a metaphor. If I was tasked to build a house and I came to the plot of land where the foundation has been laid, let's call the foundation school, with my truck loaded up with all kinds of tools to build the house, but the person who is not from my company, who's not from my construction company, tells me, okay, you can't use the bulldozer. You can't use wrenches. You can't use T-squares. You can't, and they have all this list of stuff that I can't use before I start building the house. That's the same way with language. We're putting up barriers against the tools that students could use to build the best speech or essay that they can. But once you start off with the list of things they can't use, which is basically arbitrary, you're cutting them off at the very beginning and almost guaranteeing failure, almost guaranteeing a substandard products, right? That because you can't use all of your tools.
Yep. So a question that came up in the chat, what courses do you envision this book being best suited for? I feel like you maybe started an answer to that question, with this analogy. And
exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Well, so I'm a multidisciplinary scholar. I operate in several disciplines simultaneously. I don't separate them the way that the academy does, like English and communication studies and gender studies and theater. This book is, I would say, is best suited for any course for which language, culture, education, race are topics. And it does a lot of work for instructors because of the activities, the lessons, the questions, and the readings that are already there. It's an opportunity. When we were doing this book, I thought of this as an opportunity for my colleagues to learn alongside their students. I say that because we had started having conversations at the University of Waterloo right after the George Floyd protests. And many of my white colleagues would always say the same thing. It became a common refrain that they didn't know. They don't know what to do. It's not their experience. They had no idea. And I was often shocked and dismayed because it's like, don't they watch the same news and read the same newspapers and interact with colleagues who, so how could there be this melees of something that where this understanding of Black culture and experience doesn't infiltrate the mind? But I had to accept it as true. I had to accept it as true because it keeps being said. So the way in which the book is designed is to also inform and educate those for whom, for whatever reason, there has been that melees. There has been that that divide in understanding, or that differentiated understanding, so that if they take the book as is and themselves participate in the questions, themselves read the readings, themselves do the activities, they will grow at the very least in an understanding of what these debates are about and an understanding of experience at the very least, and possibly can grow even more to being allies.
Yeah, I think for first year writing particularly, I think people want to do this and they have this stifling fear of their students being punished across the curriculum, right? That if they employ these strategies that, this next professor in line will be coming to the composition department or to the student themselves and saying, what are you doing here? And I saw a lot of that both in our chat now, but also just in the registration forms, is this fear of, not serving your students according to other faculty.
Well, that's a painful and deeply offensive way of putting it. It is deeply painful and deeply offensive because it is almost saying, if we address white supremacy, dominant language ideology, and anti-Black sentiment, then we will not be accepted. So we would rather accede to white supremacy and racism than to do what we know is best. That's why it's a deeply offensive and painful construction, to put it that way. The other thing, I try to address this. We keep talking about the proxy down the hall, the races across the street. There's only one for sure person that you know is racist when you have that idea. You can't, if you can't point to the actual person that we can go then talk to and debate, if you can't send us to the office that is criticizing you, then the person who has the power is you. And we can no longer accept that people are going to point elsewhere. What you are becoming is the proxy. If that's your argument, you are the proxy for the white supremacists. You are the proxy for the racists. You are the proxy for the person who does not want this to end. And the proxy of the person who is rallying against best practices and in language, the best practice in language pedagogy. So I had asked you earlier if we could show 2 videos. This might be the best place to do that. And I can show both of them. I want to show first the young man who's being interviewed by his teacher.
Yeah, and I do want to say that I agree, Vershawn. I think the faculty worried about these things are feeling a real and legitimate pain, about wanting to be, I'm just going to use the term change agent. Like they want to do this. And yeah, we need to overcome that fear and be the people who start this institutional level change.
Well, Christina, I think that the best thing to do is to do it. And the thing to do is to face the fear. And here's the thing, if the fear is about other people, I mean, I'm confused about why anybody would think that it's okay to negotiate racism. I find, that's why I say I find that offensive. Now, I'm not saying that it's not real. It can be both real and it still can be offensive. It's offensive to me as a Black man, where somebody will say, well, I don't want change to offend the person down the hall, but you can go across the street and get battered and beat down or called all sorts of horrible things and treated differently because we want to keep these other people happy. I cannot accept it. And I refuse to accept it personally.
So we offer courage. I would say then what we offer in this conversation is we want courage, right? For everybody to feel like they can have the courage to move forward.
Well, Maya Angelou says, if you don't have courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. Mm-hmm. Consistently loving, you can't be consistently any other trait or virtue without courage. So I'm going to go to this young man.
Let's play this. I think we have just the right amount of time to show these videos. So we just need to make sure we get volume, Lindsay. I'm not sure if.
Currently, or almost be a different.
Can you guys hear now?
Yeah, I think it started up right now.
Realized, or maybe you never realized until this moment though, that you have to maybe act differently or almost be a different person in different situations. Like, for example, with your friends versus maybe what I expected you in school, or when you're with your grandma versus, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand. And like, sometimes you gotta act different like this. How I act now, I won't act like that, like if I get a job. Mm-hmm. No, not like working at like Burger King, not that job. I mean like a job, like it's like this. I had to talk more professional and all that. Yeah. So yeah, you have to.
And I think you're capable of doing that, right? Mm-hmm. So you're able to like switch it on and off, right?
Yeah.
What do you think?
I don't like to because like, I don't like to do it. That's why I'm in the NFL.
Why don't you like to do that? Because it feels just unnatural, like unreal.
Okay, so my point here in showing this video is about this teacher who is engaged in a conversation with this young man about code switching, right? She's like, you can turn it on and off. And this young man says, yeah, I can turn it on and off. As a matter of fact, he introduced why he should turn it on and off. But did you notice that he said, I don't like to do it? He introduced that. She never asked him what his affective relationship was to doing it. He introduced that and said, I don't like to do it. She repeated it, but like, you can. And you saw his face go, yeah, but I'm not going to do that. And he said, I'm going to escape doing it by going to the NFL. Since academics won't allow me to do something different, and it's what's expected of me, I'm going to ignore and not be in that arena at all. That is a problem. So people can have this double conscious attitude that this young man showed at the beginning, which is to say, I recognize what dominant language ideology is, so I'm not going to even play that game at all, and I'm just going to go outside of it. That's why I wanted to show this. The next one that I wanted to show is one of a professional who tried to do the switching, and the switching didn't work for his job as a journalist.
Oh, wow.
Right? So code meshing actually was the better approach for him.
Let's see that, Lindsay.
What's your reaction to what Chandra said and its application here at CBC?
Oh, finally, somebody's talking about this.
Good.
Yeah, I've been here for like 14 years, and this is the first time that I hear us tackling the issue. I agree with him. I think we sound white, and if all we have is sound, and we're not reflecting the diversity of accents that we hear outside of our doors, then we're not doing a good job at diversity. I call it the diversity facade. You know, all of our hosts have amazingly diverse names, but they all sound sure very, very white.
And why do you think it took so long to initiate this conversation?
Well, I think that there has to be a political will at the very top of any corporation to actually make it happen at the bottom. And it just, I don't think it's there.
And Nick, what do you think of how this applies at CBC?
Well, I agree with some of the things that I heard from your previous guests. I mean, I'm also myself someone who used to do code switching himself. I mean, before I was a manager, I was a producer of a radio show, and I used to also be on air for many, many, many years. And I always remember the first piece I tried to do I was doing a piece for a basketball game. I was covering the Raptors, and I had to come back and voice. It was the very first piece I ever did for CBC. And I was in the studio for, I swear to God, the game ended at 10:30. It was almost 12:30, 1:30 in the morning. I still was trying to voice it to make it sound right, you know, like you make it sound like it's perfect for CBC. And the engineer in the booth is like, oh, just do it again, do it again, do it again. And I was so frustrated. I was like, you know what, this is just never going to air. So the person who was engineering the piece said, let me call, you know, the head of sports at the time, a guy named Phil Dugas. So Phil comes out of his house, he comes down to CBC at like 2:30 in the morning, and he goes, just tell me the story the way you would tell your friends. So I said, okay. So I told him the story the way I would tell my friends. And he goes, okay, that's it. That's a cut. That's what we're going to run in the morning. And I said, pardon me? He said, I just want you to sound like yourself. And now, to me, I was fortunate that I had someone like that in my corner from the Giddy app, right? He was trying to tell me to have my own authentic voice. But I worked in a place where that wasn't happening.
Thank you. That's all that we have to hear of that. The point here, Christina, is that was his first piece, and it took him forever after the game to get it together because he was trying to code switch, trying to get it to sound quote unquote right, acceptable to, he doesn't say this, but to, you know, a public that would judge a Black voice negatively. But his boss said, say it to like you would say it to your friends, and that was a take. That was it. So the point here is that, and thank God that was his first piece, because then, as you heard, he carried that out throughout the rest of his career. But imagine starting there with students and allowing them to bring that power that they're bringing with them from their cultural heritage to the assignments and to learning how to be effective speakers. or writers, how much more advanced they will be than where this guy was when he struggled, right, to write, to deliver one news piece.
Yes, and we want to enable this change in our classrooms. You know, we are at the top of the hour, and I just want to invite everyone who would like more attention to this text and how it can support you. Please reach out to us at Top Hat and Fountainhead Press. And we are happy to share the book with you, discuss it further. You can make appointments with us. We want to enable the change that you all want to see. And I thank Vershawn so much for hosting this conversation.
Well, we have to give some time for Q&A. I know we might go over.
Okay, well, I will say that I've been handling the Q&A as we've been going. So I will say that I managed to integrate in some Q&A, but I think that for those who can stay on an extra minute for Q&A, we have a comment that responds to both. Can you see the comments, Vershawn, by the way, on your view?
Yeah, so I can see two here, and that's why I wanted to respond to this one from Mark Lazio, who was asking how to help colleagues on all these things. I tend to think that this is, again, we're not displacing one thing with the other. What we're displacing basically is white supremacy that has tended, and racism that have tended to desegregate. So we focus on the action, right? The action now is integration. The action is integration. So instead of, because people get touchy when you say racism and white supremacy,
right,
and they don't really get it, we say, yes, we are preparing them for the professional world, and we are preparing them to meet the standards in the best way possible by using languages as a resource. We're not displacing those rules. We're talking as well about these and how they operate together. And if you're not doing that, then we're really not really doing the real job. And then someone says, can you point to works that practice or analyze code meshing in published work across the disciplines? What I can do, no, I can't point to that because people haven't, that work is what is being developed now. But what I can do is offer a way to get that yourself or to ask people to do this. So what I do in my classroom is I give a substantial amount of marks. It's probably the weight of a major paper. And I ask students to find examples of code meshing in academic articles over the last 5 years in the discipline in which their major is in. So if they're in health or biology or chemistry, they have to read academic articles in last 5 years and bring the examples to me. They all do it. That's the one assignment where they almost always get the points for a major paper by bringing and identifying examples. It does several things. It does examples it does remarkable work for a teacher's knowledge of code mesh work being present in other disciplines, but it also allows the students to see that what they're being trained and how they're being taught to write is actually the best practice of writing now.
Yeah, I actually loved what Tanya posted a minute ago, just saying, if someone from down the hall comes and asks me about what I'm doing, it gives me a chance to start the conversation, right?
Right, exactly. I love that.
Yeah, it's really great.
How would you respond to brand new high school teachers who want to do this kind of work, but are scared of their jobs because they are asked to use state standards and prepare students for standards? I would give the same response. Look, what are they afraid of? I mean, first of all, we have to realize what we're saying when we say that people are afraid, that white supremacy and racism are so entrenched that if we don't accede to them, people will lose their jobs. That already is an occasion for protest. That is an occasion for protest. But the second thing is this. When we talk about preparing students for standardized tests, if they cannot use all of the linguistic resources, like building the house, already setting them behind. They're already behind. So this is one way to have this conversation, right? One aspect of this conversation is to say that we will no longer be committed to white supremacy. That's first and foremost. The way in which white supremacy manifests itself in language instruction is through standard language ideology. Standard language ideology is the belief that only one group of people's language habits are the ones that we should adopt for school and professional work. That is how white supremacy gets translated into standard language ideology. Well, we shouldn't be about that business anyway. And the way that the world works is that language is so much more diverse in the actual practice of it. So teachers shouldn't be afraid to help students develop the most rhetorically effective ways to be successful. That's the bottom line. That's what we're asking them to do on standardized tests. One example, this reading is not in the book, but people can go out and get it, or it might be a supplemental reading. I can't remember. But Geneva Smitherman's essay, The Black of the Berry, studied hundreds of standardized writing tests. Mm-hmm. They didn't know what the student's racial background was when they marked the test. The teachers didn't. But the students that used Black rhetorical features scored higher than all other students.
Wow.
When they were scored blindly, right? But then when then they put the names and the races to the papers, and they saw how those linguistic features that emanated from Black rhetoric actually helped advance those papers to the top. I would say that any teacher who's questioning whether or not it's useful should read that essay and why it's important to incorporate Black English.
We should send these video resources and that essay. We can have our reps do follow-up to attendees and share some of these resources. But yes, I'm feeling like the next protest that needs to happen, Vershawn, right, is the direct faculty to admin arguments, that we have to fight for this change. And
Kristen, it's what we already do. The thing that strikes me about this, as what I try to get other people to sort of understand, is that this isn't a question about what's best for the students. It's not a question about the best practices, because we should already be about that. We should never be saying we would sacrifice what's best because an administrator thinks that standard language ideology is better when we know that it's not. And we know that it's not because it's not how people write in the real world. It's only an ideology that we adopt to negotiate our relationships with each other and to put certain kinds of students in a deficit position, asking them to give up something in order to gain something, when in fact, what they're bringing to the table is already so rich and important and useful in this context.
I love that. So do you have any parting words for all the people so kind to join us? I felt like those were great parting words, this, false equivalency idea. I think the parting words would be for people, if they're on the fence about the book or they're trying to think about ways to use the book, is to allow the work of the book as it has been developed over a period of time with great interest and great care, to do that, to have the conversations that are in the book and to pursue it with honesty, integrity, and authenticity, because there's a real opportunity here, I think, to
to be edified, but we also, as educators, have a responsibility to take stock about how we are participating in our culture, in our classrooms.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rashawn.
Thank you.
Invigorating and excellent as always. And I thank everyone who attended this conversation and that are committed to the ideas we talked about today. And you can look for this ongoing conversation series as we figure out the next thing we will ask Rashawn to help us figure out in our teaching worlds. Thanks again, Rashawn, and everybody.
Should I stay on for a moment, or am I free to go?
You are free to go.
Okay.
We can all be free to go, but again, my heartfelt thanks.
Thank you.
Fabulous. All right. Bye, everyone.